Uh, we just wanted to welcome you to our last of the spring programs. And I don't want you to think that we don't do any programs during the summer, but we try to get it out on Facebook. And we do have memberships. Does get an email when we have something happening. Typically, it's what we call a pop-up field trip. And so we wait until there's actually kind of something to highlight. And then just, so one example would be the Swift Night Out, which would be in September. So you gotta find out which chimney are they going to. Last year it was Trowbridge School. And so then, so that way we can end up with good details and be accurate. I also wanted to mention, we probably will hear a little about the periodical cicada from our expert up here. And we're gonna do a field trip. Most likely it'll be June 1st, but I put 2 dates on the paper. If you're interested, I have papers over there with the cicadas from 2007 that I collected. Hopefully we'll hear all about the Wisconsin trends from PJ Leash, and I know he was just on Larry Mueller today, so if you got to hear that, you'll really get the full story. I think that we did hand out all the tickets, right? Okay. So are we ready?
I'm ready.
Like PJ ready.
Okay, you can start.
All right, thank you, Carol. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. As you just heard, and maybe you heard me earlier today on Larry Mueller's show, it's been kind of a busy day for me, making a lot of rounds with the topic of periodical cicadas. That's getting a lot of attention, and it will continue to get a lot of attention for the next about 2.5 months. And so I've been doing a lot of media interviews just in the last week or so, probably about 10 of them in the last week and a half, I would say. So it's definitely a hot topic. I'm going to talk about those a little bit, but what I want to do tonight is really look at kind of a broader overview of some of the insect and arthropod trends here in Wisconsin. And this is really coming from my perspective of serving as director of the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab. So this is a lab on the UW-Madison campus. We've been around since 1976, so getting close to 50 years at this point. And the lab itself was started with the goal of providing assistance to extension colleagues around the state. So that could be an agriculture, horticulture agent. And it was really started as kind of a 3-month trial, and it was so successful. Here we are decades later. So it definitely gets a lot of use. And I get every year about 2,500 identification requests from folks around Wisconsin, a small percentage from out of state or out of country, but the vast majority, like 95, 96% of all my cases are from within Wisconsin. So over the last decade, that's been about 25,000 or so data points. It allows me to pick out some of these trends just from insects I've identified, and then further conversations with colleagues in the UW entomology department, other government organizations like Department of Ag and DNR and so on. So let's dive into it. And before we talk about the actual insects, I think it's important just to recap last year's weather patterns, because that can have such a dramatic impact and influence on some of the insect patterns that we saw. And if one thing stands out from last year, it was the dry, drouthy conditions. But if you look back a little bit farther, we really have had some drouthy conditions for really a couple of years, going back to about 2021. Prior to that point, we generally had pretty good precipitation, but at various points in the year and various spots in the state, about the last 3-ish years have been pretty dry. One thing that stood out for me, you see this map on the right-hand portion of the slide. So this is from a website called the U.S. Drought Monitor. And if you just search for that on Google, you'll find it. Just search for U.S. Drought Monitor, and they've got color-coded maps. And essentially, the darker the color, the drier it is. And so over the last few years, we've had various shades of color versus if you're okay moisture-wise, the map is just whitish with no shading in. But last year, there were some really big chunks of orange in the state, which is severe drought, red, which is extreme drought. And then for the first time ever in the 20 or so year history of the US Drought Monitor Project, we hit a category D4, which is exceptional drought. Prior to 2023, when I saw that color on the map, it was states like California, which we know in the last decade have had some very significant severe droughts. But all of a sudden, we were getting to that stage in Wisconsin. So you can see on this map, kind of southwestern Wisconsin was really, really dry. And then also up towards the Bayfield Peninsula, from about Cornucopia area and west of there into Douglas County, exceedingly dry up there. Now, why does this matter? Well, again, some insects and related creatures can be influenced by moisture. Some can really do well when there's dry conditions, things like spongy moth, which we'll talk about, spider mites, and plenty of others as well. We know some other insects like mosquitoes can thrive when there's really wet conditions. So there's a lot of up and downs the last few years with some of our insect patterns out there. And this can happen either through direct influence. Sometimes the dry conditions might help out the physiology of some of these creatures. In other cases, there may be a more indirect route. And what I mean by that is for some of the insects we're going to talk about that are, say, plant pests, if you had trees that were perfectly healthy, they might have been spared, but you had trees that were kind of running ragged because of the drought, and that opened the door, made them susceptible to some of these other insect pests that have popped up. So we're going to talk about a number of those as well. Now, a couple other things to point out. Weather-wise, when we look back at the snowfall, not from this last winter, but the one before that. So the winter of 2022 to 2023 was very, very snowy. That's what we're looking at with that blue map on the left-hand portion of the slide. And the darker the blue, the more snow that we had. So southern Wisconsin that year, where I'm located, Dane County, we still had a pretty snowy winter, 82 inches. But look at the North Woods. Those dark blue counties had 100, in some cases 200, almost 300 inches of snow for some locations. And that meant that even though it was drier as a whole, there was a lot of moisture in the spring coming from melting snow. And so that could influence some of the insects like mosquitoes. There are some species that can very specifically rely on the water from melting snow to go about their business. Now, looking at the details a little bit further, if we focus on the middle chart from last year, this is a precipitation chart. And what it is showing from the state climatology office is if it's a green bar above kind of that midline, it means it was wetter than average. If it was yellow and below that midline, it was drier than average. So again, 2023, we started out way wetter than average. It was the wettest January through April on record for the state of Wisconsin. Then it's almost like a switch flipped and we went to extremely dry. So from May through about September, that was the fourth driest period from May to August ever. Then it yo-yoed again for October, was pretty darn wet. We finally got some rains, but then November again flip-flopped and it was very, very dry again, the eighth driest November ever. So it was really kind of an unusual weather pattern. When we look at temperatures for last year, the chart on the right, the zero horizontal line, that's kind of the long-term average temperature per month. And we see pretty much every month was above average, and in some cases way above average, like last January, the fifth warmest January ever, almost 10 degrees Fahrenheit above average. The only month that was slightly below average was July, and it was just barely pretty darn close to average. And then just a few months ago, we had our warmest December ever, which was about 13 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, which, kind of makes sense. We have been in that El Nino pattern and that can have some significant influences. But in general, last year was drier than usual and also hotter than usual. So one of the biggest elephants in the room for many spots in the state is this insect, the spongy moth, which it's a non-native insect, used to be called gypsy moth. So it probably needs little to no introduction to this group. It's really originally from Europe, and it got in the US 1860s, and it's been spreading westward from New England. And so the leading edge of this wildfire, so to speak, goes about 2/3 of the way through Wisconsin. So most of the eastern part of the state, they're very abundant and prevalent. And the far western edge of the state, not so much. They're just kind of getting there very slowly. But these things can feed on a very, very wide range of trees and shrubs and be very, very destructive. Now, we have been seeing spongy moth trend upwards now for about 4 or so years. Prior to that point, in most parts of the state, they were relatively low. So this is something that's been trending. The dry weather can play a really important role with this because of the influence on a pathogen that can specifically infect these caterpillars called Entomophaga myrmica. This is an introduced fungus that kills off the caterpillars. So when you have a dry spring, it suppresses this beneficial fungus. Spongy moth can do really well. Versus if we had a rainy spring, it would cause them to become sick and populations could crash. So for this insect, because they've been in such a big outbreak phase, I'm really hoping we have some rainy conditions this spring to help curb that situation. When we look at some of the surveys by government organizations, StatCap or Department of Agriculture, they do some trapping surveys, and they have had some record catches of the adult male moths. The DNR does some aerial surveys for defoliation of forested areas. Last year, we set a new record for areas defoliated in the state with about 375,000 acres. So big patches of woods defoliated outright by this insect. And then also with some of the weather patterns a year ago, that heavy snowfall in northern Wisconsin, that might have helped buffer some of the egg masses that were out there close to ground level, and it might have insulated them as well. Also looking at this, sometimes folks wonder, what about winter kill? Will that affect it? Well, again, we had a El Nino winter, so not very cold out there. We had one kind of polar vortex snap, but every time I checked the weather report, it kept getting a little bit milder and milder. To really have an impact on spongy moth eggs, you need it to be really cold for a long period of time. You have to have about 48 to 72 hours at -20 Fahrenheit. That's the air temperature, not the wind chill. We did not get close to that of several days in a row where it never got above -20. There's another paper out of Michigan years ago that looked at the number of days at -26 Celsius. And basically you could plot out this trend line. The more days you had cold, the greater the egg mortality. But again, we had a mild winter, so it would have helped with egg survival overall. Just to highlight some of those spongy moth trends, on the left, we have trapping efforts from Department of Ag. These small blue dots mean very few moths caught in traps. So again, the western edge hasn't quite gotten there yet in Wisconsin. And we see that leading edge of this wildfire kind of snake its way through the state. And those larger reddish spots, those are traps with high counts. Now, you'll notice that in the eastern part of the state, there's areas where there's no trapping done, like Green Bay area and stuff like that. Doesn't mean these insects aren't present. It just means that Department of Ag knows they're already there. They don't need to do trapping there. They're trying to figure out where that leading edge is to strategize some of their management efforts. And so what does this tell us? Well, we know the last couple of years we've had very high population levels from about Lake Geneva area, Walworth County, up through Janesville, Madison, towards Devil's Lake State Park, snaking its way up towards Eau Claire area, and then very heavy populations up towards Ashland and Bayfield County. So a lot of destruction from that. When we look at numerically speaking trap counts, if we go back about 4 or 5 years ago, 2019, 2020, 21, things were relatively quiet, but we can see these have trended upwards now for a couple years. From 2021 to 22, we basically doubled our number of moths caught in the traps. So 2022, that was a very high number there. And then we had 2023, we doubled that again. So that was an all-time record for male moths caught in traps. So this tells us we really are experiencing an outbreak of this insect in the state. I talked about defoliation by this insect in wooded areas. That's what we see in this chart on the left. So if we look back from about 2014 to 2020, 2021, basically minimal to no defoliation of forested areas in the state. And then we had a big jump 2022, about 85,000 acres. And then in 2023, about 375,000 acres. That's an all-time record in terms of destruction by this insect. Where was that occurring in wooded areas? that's what we see in this map on the right. So there's some scattered defoliation in like Walworth County, southeastern Wisconsin. You go up towards the Spring Green area, Sauk County, Devil's Lake State Park area, Muir Lake State Park, up towards Marinette, Kanto counties, just due north of Green Bay, and then very significant defoliation in Ashland County and Bayfield County in far northern parts of the state. I will say I drove through part of the UP of Michigan last July where there was very heavy defoliation. Even though it was July, it was a very surreal feeling. It was almost like driving through the woods in April, like this time of the year where spring ephemerals are starting to pop out, things are starting to green up. But typically those tree canopies should have been full, but they were stripped bare. So this insect can be very, very destructive. Now, if we look at kind of a theoretical population cycle of these, if we have rainy years, that tends to keep their population in check due to predators and parasites and pathogens and things like that. But if we run into some ideal weather conditions, i.e. dry weather, their populations can shoot upward in just the matter of a few years. Now, eventually they're going to get to a point where the populations are so high that we're going to have issues like overcrowding that can encourage some density dependent factors like parasites and pathogens to kick in. Is that going to happen this year? That's possible. And that's really kind of the $1 million question is when will the population of this insect decline? And we just don't know that for sure. If all of a sudden the rains stop and we have a dry spell for the next 2 months, that could allow their populations to do very well again this year, versus if the rains continue, that might help us out in the long run. Now, just to highlight what these insects look like in the larval stage, because this is the destructive feeding stage. When they're really little, they're blackish with some kind of pale spots on there, and those will feed both day and night. And if you have egg masses, maybe not in your yard, but a nearby area, they can actually do something called ballooning, which is something spiders do as well. They put out a silk strand and they can get caught with the wind, for example, and move around that way. As the caterpillars get bigger, they take on their more characteristic appearance, grayish with these raised pairs of nodules, blue and red, running down the middle of the back. And at that point, they switch and they become mostly nocturnal with their feeding habits. They eventually go through a total of about 5 or 6 substages or instars, and it's really the last 2 instars or substages that are the most destructive. So what I mean by that is you can have spongy moth caterpillars feeding for weeks, maybe a month or more, not seeing that much damage. And then they molt and they transform to these more mature stages when they really start to chow down. And it's like a switch is flipped. The amount of consumption of leaf material increases dramatically, and they can really start stripping trees very, very quickly. Just to illustrate that point, that's what this graphic on the left does. So this is technically for a different caterpillar, but it's the same general trend. So what this shows is these little square shapes. Those are the different instars or substages of a particular caterpillar. And we can see when the caterpillar is small, it's a first instar. It just eats that little box of leaf area. Not much. You might not even notice that on leaves. As it gets a little bit bigger, second, third instars, not feeding a whole lot, fourth instar, a little bit more, but then it jumps to the 5th and 6th instar. And that's when some of these caterpillars are doing 80 to 90% of their actual damage. So I get a lot of calls from the public saying these insects showed up overnight, they're wreaking havoc. And really the story is they've probably been there for a month and you've just missed them up to this point. So it can give the appearance of almost overnight damage when this happens. Now, I mentioned this previously. Do we have an ace in a hole? There's this fungal disease called Entomophaga myimaga, which can do very well if we have rainy conditions. Now, you have to look at the critical window or time period in spring when these insects are active. That's usually going to be the months of May and June. I don't care if it's super rainy in July and August and September. If you are dry during that critical window, this fungus is going to be suppressed. And that's exactly what happened last year. From May through August, we were pretty much bone dry. We did get some rain in a month like October, but it didn't help us out. So this particular fungus, it was deliberately introduced to help control this insect. first couple times it didn't work. And then all of a sudden, the late 80s, it popped up. And so when we have rainy years as a whole in the US, this disease can really help us out, but humidity and moisture is critical. So if anything, for this insect in the outbreak that we're experiencing, cross your fingers and hope for some rainy conditions this spring. And then just some final thoughts about spongy moth. We do have a lot of kind of tools in the toolbox, so to speak, that can include non-chemical options in your own yards, like burlap bands and sticky bands and things like that. But you really have to look at the bigger picture overall. Now, associated with spongy moth, this insect can kind of go hand in hand. So this is an insect called two-line chestnut borer. It is a native close relative of the emerald ash borer, which we know is an invasive insect. This one's native, and in most conditions, it's what I would call well-behaved. What I mean by that is if you have oak trees, that's the tree it's associated with, oaks. It used to be associated with chestnuts way back in the day when we had those, but it's associated with oaks. If you have oak trees that are healthy and happy, it leaves those alone. It goes to oak trees that are stressed and compromised. So that could be an oak tree that is experiencing drought stress, or an oak tree that is experiencing defoliation from spongy moth, or an oak tree that is getting the double whammy of both drought and spongy moth. So with that said, there's a lot of stressed oak trees in the state. Once they're stressed, they're predisposed, and the door is kind of open for this insect to move in. And just like emerald ash borer, it starts causing some branch dieback in the canopy. And so you can get trees starting to lose branches in their canopy. And I am seeing a lot of oak trees that are big, mature trees in the state starting to have activity of this insect, which can be a concern for those high value trees that are maybe 200, 300-year oaks in folks' yards. So this insect has definitely been popping up. If we look at some numbers coming out of my lab, let's look at that little chart on the right. So years like 2019 at the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab, I had 10 cases. That's really pretty par for the course. 2020, 11 cases. So really pretty average there. Started to see an increase 2021, 16 cases, 2022, 26, 2023, 48 cases. So again, that is a definite increase. That tells me there's a lot of stressed oak trees out there because this opportunistic insect is starting to get in. Very similar to emerald ash borer, the larvae feed under the bark, they damage those vascular tissues, they leave D-shaped exit holes. And if those oak trees were in perfectly good health, this insect wouldn't be an issue. It's more going after those stressed trees. Also along those lines, another very closely related species, which is also native, this is the bronze birch borer, which you can guess from the name goes to birch trees. And just like the two-line chestnut borer, this one is having a good time because there's a lot of stressed birch trees out there from the drought, from defoliation by spongy moth, or defoliation by another insect like Japanese beetle. So this one is out there causing some problems for us as well in the state. And then likewise, there's a whole bunch of other insects that I simply refer to as secondary borers. These are insects that in most cases are going to be pretty well behaved. They spare and ignore the healthy trees. They're going to trees that are compromised due to drought or weather conditions or insect attack or disease. And I have seen a definite increase at the diagnostic lab in terms of samples of these. So there's some like flat-headed apple tree borer on the left that can go to really a wide range of stressed, compromised hardwood trees. They often like smaller ones, especially nursery stock and recently planted trees. They can go to larger ones too. On conifers like spruces and other ones, there's a white spotted sawyer in the upper right-hand corner. That one can be very common around the state, but especially in northern areas. And then another one I've seen a lot of the last couple of years, painted hickory borer, which has a really pretty cool appearance with those black and whitish stripes, black body with yellow and whitish stripes on it. Really a striking insect. That one's associated with stressed dying hickory trees. So again, with the drought causing stress to trees, these insects seem to be doing very well at the moment. Another sort of secondary beetle I've seen lots of would be bark beetles. Now, when you hear of bark beetles, you maybe think of the news reports from the Western US, places like Colorado and Montana, British Columbia. Those are different species of bark beetles. There's actually hundreds of species of bark beetles out there. For the most part, they're all typically small brown beetles, but I have seen a definite increase in some of these species here in the state. This one on the left with the crazy looking hairdo on its head, that is the species Pseudopediopterus minotesimus. It's associated with stressed oaks. So again, with the drought, with spongy moth, with two-line chestnut borer, makes total sense that this insect is doing really well. In the top, there's Pediogenes hopkinsi. This one is specifically associated with the smooth-barked branches of dead, dying, stressed white pine trees. So again, if you've got white pines out in the landscape, they haven't been getting enough rain or supplemental water, and they are really stressed, these insects can start attacking the smoother branches or smooth bark portions of the trunks. And then on the bottom right-hand corner, this is the eastern ash bark beetle, which is specifically associated with dead, dying ash trees. And because of emerald ash borer, that insect is having a really good time at the moment as well. Speaking of emerald ash borer, this insect has been in the state for a long, long time, going back to 2008, so well over a decade at this point, about, I think, 16 years if my math is correctly this July. At this point, it's spread pretty much statewide in terms of counties where it's been detected. There's still 3 counties in the northwestern part of the state, Taylor, Washburn, and Burnett, where we have not had officially confirmed detections, but it's really only a matter of time there. When we look at a slightly different map, one thing that stands out and what this map shows is on a finer scale where EAB is known to occur in areas that are in green or blue. That's areas, townships, or tribal lands where we know emerald ash borer is. The areas that are pale, grayish, or yellowish, those are spots in the state where we have not confirmed the presence of this insect yet. So that tells me northern Wisconsin, about 40–50% of the state really has not yet seen this insect. So this is something that's still going to be playing out over the course of our lifetimes and really over the next probably 20, 30, 40 years as a whole. Now, numerically speaking, when we think of ash trees, most of our ash trees are actually in northern Wisconsin. There's some areas, swamplands, that can be 80–90% plus black ash. So even though we have a lot along wetland areas and rivers in southern Wisconsin, there's a lot more numerically speaking in northern parts of the state. Now, one final map for emerald ash borer. This comes from colleagues in the DNR. Every year they put out just an excellent report called the Forest Health Annual Report. They talk about a wide range of disease and pest issues going on in the state. But this map here, what it shows is the severity of ash tree damage and mortality in the state. So counties that are darker have a greater percentage of ash trees that are dead and dying. So for this map, if counties are that dark grayish or blackish color, it means that for those spots in the state, ash trees, 90+% of them are dead or dying at this point. Counties that are red, it's between 50 and 90%. Orange counties, it's maybe about 50-ish% or so. And then counties that are yellow, between 25 and 50%. So again, this highlights the point that northern parts of the state really haven't been affected that much, and emerald ash borer is going to continue to wreak havoc for decades to come. So let's talk about the periodical cicadas. If you caught me on Larry Mueller show today, I had a blast just talking about these insects. I'm really excited for them. I turn 40 next year in January, and I will admit I have not seen these myself with my own eyes. I missed them in 2007. In 2007, I graduated from college at UW-Parkside in Kenosha County. I moved to Madison June that year to start grad school, and I missed them, and I wish I had seen them. But this is going to be my first chance to see these insects this year. I'm really, really excited for it. You've maybe been hearing in the news about the double brood emergence. What we are going to be seeing in Wisconsin is only one brood, though. That's brood 13, Roman numeral 13, which are 17-year periodical cicadas. They last popped out in 2007. Prior to that, it was 1990, 1973, and you can do the math back from there. Our earliest records of them in the state go back to about 1837, if my memory serves me correctly. So we've had records going back almost 200 years at this point, before Wisconsin was even a state. I do want to mention, if you want to learn more about our periodical cicadas, what do they look like? What do they sound like? What do they do? What's their life cycle like? I recently launched a dedicated website to this topic. It's a really easy website to find. It's cicadas.wisc.edu. So that's a very simple website to remember. And there's a whole compendium of cool cicada information in terms of where they'll be, what they look like, what they sound like. Interestingly, a lot of the old records related to periodical cicadas were somewhat limited in their resolution. And that's what I'm getting to with this slide. So you can dig in the old records and find information and maps. And so this is a map from US Forest Service, which has been making the rounds in news articles and things like that. And yes, it shows some counties in Wisconsin that are shaded in, but really this map isn't up to date. It doesn't tell you a very good story, because we know some of the counties on this map, like Milwaukee, Waukesha, Jefferson County, we just really haven't had any records for decades now. And so we're probably not going to be seeing these cicadas in those areas. So this last winter and early spring, I spent a lot of time digging through about 160 years of newspaper records, government reports, to develop our most up-to-date map with the best resolution possible. And I do have that posted on my website. This is the map that I created. So you can see there's some counties that historically we have had some mention in the literature or in research collections of periodical cicadas, but some of these counties, we just haven't had any sightings or specimens reported for decades and decades. Places like Lafayette County, Milwaukee, Waukesha, Jefferson, Dodge, Columbia County. So the odds of seeing these insects in those areas are probably pretty darn low. There are, however, some hot spots in the state. If you want to see these, the single best spot is going to be the Lake Geneva area in early June. Some other hot spots would be the Janesville area, also down in the Beloit area. And then when you get in western Wisconsin, just west of Madison, we get into some of the towns close to the Wisconsin River, Spring Green, Boscobel, out towards Prairie du Chien, down towards Dubuque, Iowa. And we know, especially Iowa County, Richland, Sauk County, there's some little populations tucked away in the hills in that driftless area. One thing that's been really interesting to me, though, is I have a suspicion there may be some additional populations out there that haven't been documented in the driftless region. So if I won the lottery and wasn't working, or I could just take the month of May and June off, what I would love to do is just drive some of the back roads in rural Iowa, Sauk, Richland, Grant, and Crawford counties, because there's probably some isolated populations there that just haven't really been documented yet. Places like Madison, historically we had them decades ago. We knew about them and have specimens of them, but they haven't been found in Madison in really probably 50, 60 years. What has happened is probably the trees they were associated with had been cut down for development, either agricultural fields, parking lots, malls, housing, you name it. If those trees, their habitats cut down, they're basically going to die out in their area. So that has possibly happened in other parts of the state, like Milwaukee and Waukesha County, with all the development as well. But if you want to see this map, again, check out the cicadas.wisc.edu website. I also have a county that'll discuss or a table that discusses county by county, some notes about where these things have been found. In terms of impacts to plants, these can cause a little bit of harm, not from their feeding, but when the females go to lay eggs, they have a structure called an ovipositor that looks like a spear, and they actually cut into twigs and small branches. It's like taking a pocket knife and cutting into those twigs. On large trees, it's going to be noticeable. We see that in the center picture. That injury is called flagging, where you get these brownish dead twigs that'll fall off. Looks bad, doesn't harm the tree whatsoever, so no need for concern there. The one scenario where I would have some concern is if you are in a cicada hotspot and you have recently planted trees that are small, because if the cicadas end up damaging the outer 6, 8, 10, 12 inches for a small tree, that could be a really high percentage of the overall canopy. So in that case, cover those trees with fine mesh netting and tie it around the trunk of the tree. If you do that and the cicadas can't get to it, they can't cause damage. But I've been getting a lot of calls and questions and emails from folks worried about their tree. And I really tell them, you know, ask yourself, were you in the same spot in 2007? Have you lived in the same spot, or do you have a neighbor that did? Did you see periodical cicadas in 07? If you did not, you're not going to see them again this year. So really, rather than being broadly distributed, again, if I go back to the map, these things are isolated pins on the map. And if you're outside one of those dots on the map, you probably will not be seeing them. Most Wisconsinites will not have these in their yard. Now, a couple key things to know about 17-year cicadas. Again, the distribution is really, really restricted to specific spots on the map. I can drive from my house in Middleton through Milwaukee area to Racine County, where my folks live and where I grew up. If I wanted to visit them, I could drive 2 hours to get there and never cross paths with these insects. So again, most Wisconsinites will not see these. If you want to see them, probably have to drive to a known hotspot like the Lake Geneva area. I just mentioned this, but site history is a really key factor. If you're worried about them this year, ask yourself, did you see them in 07? Because if you didn't see them then or in 1990, you're not going to be seeing them this year. And then in general, these things are really an amazing phenomenon. And in most cases, there's really little to no need to do anything. Just enjoy it. It's like the eclipse we had a week ago. This is a really cool natural phenomenon. And in our lives, we might only have a handful of opportunities to see these insects here in the state of Wisconsin. Moving on to some other insects, Japanese beetles. It really depended where you were in the state. A lot of the southern part of Wisconsin got a bit of a reprieve last year and the last couple years. Yeah, there's some variability. There were localized populations that were maybe a little bit of hot spots, but as a whole, southern Wisconsin, we weren't too bad the last couple years, other than parts of the eastern kind of central part of the state, which I'll talk about in a second. So this highlighted red area, if you were in that part of the state, things generally weren't too bad. Where we saw more complaints and damage from Japanese beetle tended to be about the Highway 29 corridor from Green Bay to Eau Claire over to, through Wausau area. If you were in that Highway 29 corridor or farther north, that is where I was seeing the majority of my reports of damage from Japanese beetles. So it's a little bit a flip-flop compared to what I was seeing 5-10 years ago, where they really weren't very common in northern parts of the state. And then again, if I had to pick a single hot spot for last year, it probably would be this bluish patch on the state from about Sheboygan to Appleton, Oshkosh area, and then the Door County Peninsula. A little bit more activity there, and some reports of turf damage from the grub there too. Another scarab beetle I want to mention, this is something called the Asiatic garden beetle, which we just detected in the state for the first time back in 2021. It's much more common to the east of us. We confirmed it for the first time in Dane County, actually in my own backyard here in Middleton, Wisconsin, where I'm sitting at the moment. So it really makes me wonder, if I found them in my yard, I don't know how they got here. Where else are these things around me? How widely distributed are there? We know they're present in the Chicago area and probably Beloit area, and they're probably in Janesville area too, just not documented quite yet very well. The complication with these is they closely resemble some of our other native species from the genus Serica, which basically these look like small May June beetles, but they can easily be mistaken for some close native lookalikes. What's interesting about these, though, is they can be notable landscape plant pests, and they're particularly active on hot evenings. It's got to be like 10 p.m. and it's still in the 70s or 80s. Those are conditions where they are very, very active, flying around. They're strongly attracted to lights at night, but they'll feed on landscape plants and garden herbs and stuff like that at night, and then they hide during the day. So if you are out scouting during the day, you might see damage, but you could completely miss these insects entirely. So again, we've confirmed them for a couple years now in Dane County. We also confirmed them in 2023 up in Green Lake County, causing some plant damage to landscape perennials, as well as some garden plants out there. So wouldn't surprise me if these popped up in some other portions of the state as well. One other thing to note is I helped my colleagues in Minnesota confirm the presence of these in the Twin Cities area last July or so. Turns out my counterpart, Jeff Hahn at University of Minnesota, retired, and his position has not been refilled. So over time, these might start popping up in more and more locations in the state. Switching gears to another beetle, these are insects that I'm just really fond of. If I were to go back in time and do some research for a PhD project, I would very strongly consider this group, the entomines or the broad-nosed weevils. I think they're cute. They're kind of clumsy, wandering insects. These are outdoor insects associated with plants, but some species from this group, and we've got over 100 species in our area, but some species in the group will wander indoors, completely harmless, but a minor nuisance. In my own house this last summer and the one before that, I'd go in my son's bedroom and open the shades in the morning and maybe see one of these on the wall. And I would just take it and chuck it outside because they're just a harmless, clumsy nuisance. But in some cases, you can see that photo on the right, all those little black spots, those are individual broad-nosed weevils. So sometimes they were sneaking into folks' homes in very, very large numbers. And these insects can also cause a bit of plant damage on occasion. So last summer I had a case where these were abundant enough they completely defoliated a recently planted rose shrub in someone's yard. Now, the top 3 species of broad-nosed weevils I saw, number 1 by far would be strawberry root weevil. These are little, maybe about just under a 1/4 inch long beetles, kind of pear-shaped body, blackish or brownish. The second most common one would be the imported longhorn weevil, similar in size to strawberry root weevil, but kind of grayish. And then the black fine weevil or taxus weevil is a close relative of strawberry root weevil, looks similar, but it's about double the size. And that's what you can see in this photo that just popped up. So they look similar in terms of body shape and coloration, but black fine weevil is about double the size of strawberry root weevil. So these have actually been doing really well the last couple of years, I suspect, due to some of the drier conditions out there. Talking about a couple of invasive leaf beetles, family Chrysomelody, we've got 2 species I've been tracking in the state now for about a decade. There's viburnum leaf beetle on the left, which can be a very serious pest of viburnum shrubs, including native arrowwoods, can really get clobbered by this insect, and it's been wreaking havoc in some parts of the state. If I were to put a bullseye on the map for viburnum leaf beetle in Wisconsin, it's going to be the 4-county area where you folks are located, basically Milwaukee, Ozaukee, Washington, and Waukesha counties. That's the epicenter of these. They also have a strong presence in the Chicago area, northern Illinois, so some of them might have moved upwards into places like Kenosha or Racine County, but these are really moving around southeastern Wisconsin. They've also showed up in the Fox Valley from Oshkosh on up to Green Bay. They're here in Madison area. They're in Wausau area, and then also up in northern Wisconsin, Iron and Vilas counties too. So very destructive to viburnums. There's a close relative, lily leaf beetle, which is bright red, really stands out, causes significant damage to true lilies. It doesn't feed on daylilies, but true lilies, including Asiatic lilies and things like that, can be damaged. The bullseye in the state for this one is really the Wausau area, Marathon County. You can see in that map, it's radiated outwards from there, but is really spread pretty far, all the way west towards the Twin Cities area, the Milwaukee metro area where you're located, Dane County, and then Vernon County, Door County as well. So this one has really been moved around, probably by folks moving lily plants around the state. And again, it can cause some very significant damage to true lilies. Last year was an excellent year for some sucking insect pests. So it was probably the best year I've ever seen for aphids in the state. Lots of reports of those on a wide range of crops, from garden and agricultural crops to fruit trees to ornamental landscape plants as well. Also an excellent year for thrips, and also another sucking insect, which is kind of a quirky one I really don't see often, on serviceberry. These are called triosids. They're related to an insect called psyllids. Very unique appearance. They live on the undersides of leaf on serviceberry, and they have these cottony whitish filaments on their bodies. With all the aphids out there, there were a lot of aphid predators like multicolored Asian lady beetles. It was a really good year for these, and it makes sense. They had so many aphid prey items out there that they had plenty of food. So I was getting, for every aphid picture last summer, I was seeing these insects lurking in the background. So I did get a lot of calls last fall, throughout the winter, and this time of the year as well, of folks finding lots of these in their home because last year was such a good year for their prey. The hot, dry conditions also favored not an insect, but a mite. An arachnid, spider mites, can thrive under hot, dry conditions. So it was all around a really good year for populations of spider mites, like 2-spotted spider mites on the left, which can feed on a very wide range of plants. There's also spider mites like spruce spider mite that can feed on conifers, and it causes spider mite feeding causes this speckled appearance, kind of a rusty sandpapery appearance, if you will. And so last year I had an abundance of cases at my diagnostic lab of damage to conifers, could be fir, pine, spruce, you name it, harmed by these spruce spider mites. Just as another example, this was a hemlock that I saw, and it was a photo from an arborist. And at first he was wondering, is this some sort of scale insect? And it looked like that a little bit with the pale coloration from the damage. But then I received a physical sample, got it under the microscope. Sure enough, it was very, very bad damage from spruce spider mite in this situation. So the spider mites had a tremendous year last year, as well as 2022. If we have a rainy year this year, it'll probably help knock their populations back down. An insect that I saw a little bit of activity last year, but probably would be good to have on your radar, forest tent caterpillar. This is a tent caterpillar that in spring feeds on trees like aspen and a wide range of hardwood trees, but it doesn't make a silken tent. When you see the silken tent in like a cherry or crabapple tree, that's a closely related species called the eastern tent caterpillar. The forest tent caterpillar we typically see a little bit more of in northern parts of the state, and it'll go through these periodic outbreaks, but we're overdue for an outbreak at this point. We often have them about every 10 to 15 years. The last outbreak we had was back about 1999 to 2002 in northern parts of Wisconsin. So just tuck that away in the back of your head. Wouldn't surprise me if in the next 5 years we saw an outbreak of these out there. Switching gears a little bit, I talked earlier about the heavy snowpack we had last year, set up a very wet spring before things got dry. That did mean a lot of temporary ephemeral pools in some parts of the state, especially the northern third of the state or half of the state. And there's certain mosquitoes that can do very well with those temporary pools. That water will sit there for only so long before trees suck it up and remove that moisture. So some of the mosquito species like the woodland pool mosquito, Aedes canadensis, there were tremendous numbers in northern Wisconsin last year. So heavy mosquito pressure in northern Wisconsin, but we almost had a complete flip-flop in southern Wisconsin. Very little mosquito pressure last year. The mosquitoes that I was seeing were some species that can do very well even during drought conditions because they live in permanent pools of water. So things like cattail mosquito, I collected a few of those in my yard last year. That is one that is specifically associated with cattail plants, which are going to be in water that's probably going to be more stable compared to ephemeral pools in the woods. And then northern house mosquito, which can do very well in urban and suburban areas where you have infrastructure like rainwater catch basins. And that species can actually do better under drier years than rainy years, because when you have rainy years, it goes down in those catch basins on the curb and it'll flush them out and kill them. So that Culex pipiens, northern house mosquito, can actually play a role with diseases like West Nile virus. So last year, even though it was bone dry in southern Wisconsin, we actually had 12 confirmed cases of West Nile virus in the state. If we went back to rainy years, we'll often see very, very few cases overall. So when you look at the US as a whole, where do we see the most West Nile cases last year? It's actually states like Colorado, Arizona, California, where it's drier. So again, just being dry doesn't mean there's no mosquito-borne diseases out there. And then just to wrap things up over the last couple of minutes before I get to questions, I want to mention a few insects. These are landscape pests that are not here in Wisconsin yet, but I want to just talk briefly about them so that you can have them on your radar. These are insect pests that we want to keep track of in Wisconsin if and when they do show up. So if you see these, by all means, please reach out to me so I can confirm and let colleagues in the DNR and Department of Agriculture know about them so we can keep better track of them in the state. So please report these if you see them. 3 I want to talk about very briefly: spotted lanternfly. They look like big leaf hoppers or tree hoppers, but they're about 1 inch long with a really distinctive appearance. The adult is in the upper right-hand corner. The juveniles start out black with white polka dots. When they're kind of adolescents, they are reddish with black and white polka dots, and they can feed on a wide range of trees. They can pose agricultural concerns for grapes and fruit trees. They can cause damage to landscape trees. And they're also very strongly associated with an invasive tree called tree of heaven. And these insects use their sucking mouth part to suck nutrients out of the plant. That can also cause some messy situations because they produce honeydew. In a nutshell, very briefly, they can't digest all the sap they drink, and so their excrement is loaded with sugars as well. Now, in general, they're probably not going to be killing trees, but they could be a really messy nuisance. And for agricultural crops like grapes, that could reduce yields as well. So places like Pennsylvania, where this insect has been around longer, they have to do a lot of spraying in vineyards for it. This is the sort of damage that they can cause. So on the left, we see the young juveniles or nymphs feeding on more succulent tissues like on a rose bush. But on the right, we have two trees on the very right that's coated with hundreds, if not thousands of adults, all sucking sap out, and their excrement can rain down and just cause a lot of microbial growth, fungi, yeast, bacteria to grow on the base of the tree trunks. That's going to be a very messy, undesirable situation caused by this insect. They first showed up a while back, 2014 in eastern Pennsylvania. You can see on this map, blue counties, that's where it spread. Just last year, it was confirmed in the Chicago area, so it is marching its way closer and closer to Wisconsin. When we look at risk maps, based on climate variables, southeastern Wisconsin may be some good suitable habitat for these. Northern Wisconsin, not so much. And again, we have intercepted these in Wisconsin before, dead specimens, but this is a photo from Chicago area. So we've got populations knocking on the door of Wisconsin here. Another invasive to watch for, elm zigzag sawfly. This is native to parts of Asia. Really easy to pick out though. That spotted lanternfly had a distinctive appearance. This one causes very distinctive damage to elm trees. When the larvae feed on elm leaves, they cause this zigzag meandering pattern, very, very distinctive. This one first showed up about 4 years ago in Quebec, Canada. Then in Virginia, it popped up in the US in 21. In 22, it was detected in 4 states in the eastern US, North Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York. 2023, Vermont, Massachusetts, Ohio. So it's really moving around to some of those states pretty quickly. Just in the span of about 2-3 years, it's popped up in about 8 US states. So it's probably going to get to Wisconsin at some point. They can feed on a wide range of elm trees. And if there are enough of these feeding on an elm tree, it's not that one single larva causes that much damage. It's the aggregate of all the damage, kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts, if you will. But if you have enough of these, you can see that photo on the bottom right-hand corner of that slide. They can essentially defoliate entire large mature elm trees. So this could be some problems for us, and they can feed on a wide range of elm trees if and when they get here. And then the last one I want to mention, this is an insect associated with boxwoods, which I happen to like. I think they just are cool looking shrubs. I've got one in my front yard. I have to do very little maintenance to it. It's just evergreen all year round. But this is a species originally from Asia that's associated with boxwoods. And we know it's gotten to Europe where it's wreaked havoc in European boxwoods. The damaging life stage is the larva or caterpillar in the upper photo there. It's kind of Green Bay Packer colors, greenish yellowish with some black spots, and they will feed on boxwood foliage. They also create silken webbing, which can make it look like giant spiders took over the entire shrub. They have showed up in the eastern part of North America, places like Toronto, and then they've showed up recently in New York and then Michigan, Detroit, the general area of the lower peninsula of Michigan. So they're not, geographically speaking, all that far away from Wisconsin. So we should definitely have this on our radar. Again, the caterpillars, they chew on leaves, they cause defoliation. They also produce large amounts of webbing, which can really impact the aesthetic appearance of plants like this. And also boxwoods just don't really regrow back all that quickly. So this can be a very serious pest if and when this insect shows up. So again, if you see spotted lanternfly or elm zigzag sawfly or box tree moth, please let me know so that we can do our best to spread the word and maybe even have a chance at managing these and maybe eradicating them if and when they first show up. And with that, I'm glad I was able to leave a little bit of time for questions. And so I will turn it back over to you on your end of things.
Hang on. Do you want to stop screen sharing and then you can see the people that are here?
Sure.
Try and make them bigger. Remember how to do that.
There we go. I can see folks. I saw some waving in the audience.
All right. Somebody had a question in the back.
I do. I've got friends that transport firewood and they say you put the wood on the fire and then bugs will die. How do I educate them?
Hold on. Could you say that question again about the firewood?
Maybe you should read. Why not? Yeah, Carol, you're
Yeah.
closer to the
She has some friends that want to transport wood.
Uh-huh.
She's just wondering how she can educate them to not a good idea because of the insect issues.
Yeah, so I would probably direct him to some web pages from the Department of Agriculture or DATCAP. So sometimes folks maybe have the mindset of, oh, emerald ash borer is kind of statewide. I can move firewood. That's not entirely the case. The firewood rules have been changed over time, but there are technically quarantines in Wisconsin for other insects such as spongy moth. And so if you move firewood from, say, southeast Wisconsin to the western part of the state, like around the Mississippi area, which is outside the quarantine area, you'd be violating that quarantine. And so that could, be a problem, moving insects like spongy moth, but also, from a regulatory standpoint, you've broken a state quarantine. You could potentially get in trouble for that. So in general, with firewood, it's best to use it where you have it. If you've got firewood in your yard, by all means, burn it there. But if you're taking firewood and carting it across the state, you can be moving a wide range of insect pests and sometimes also plant diseases as well. So it's generally not a good idea to move firewood, period, unless it is firewood that comes from like a certified firewood dealer. That's a little bit different, but wood in that situation would have been, for example, kiln dried, which would take care of any pests or disease pathogens in it.
Question really related to if they burn the wood, doesn't that kill it? Therefore, what's the problem with moving?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. If in theory you move something, you stop at your campsite and you burn it right then and there, yeah, the odds of stuff coming out is going to be pretty darn low, but still the risk is not zero. And also, if you go from, say, southeast Wisconsin and you cross the state quarantine for spongy moth into area that is unquarantined, you'd be breaking the state quarantine rules right there.
Darcy.
I was just wondering, what if we were to find one of those last three invasive species in our yard? Just I haven't, but what is the best way to treat it when we see it? If we were to see it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's really going to depend on the individual insect because the management of each insect is going to be slightly different. So I don't think we quite have time to dig into, management of spotted lanternfly, elm zigzag sawfly, and boxwood. For something like boxwood, if you caught it and populations are low, being a caterpillar, there are some good kind of lower impact and organic options, things like Bacillus thuringiensis and spinosad and things like that could be some considerations. You'd also have to look at what stage of damage would we catch something like box tree moth in. If you're gone on summer vacation for a month and you come back and they've really decimated your shrub, at that point, does it even really make sense to try eradicating them? If they've caused really significant damage, it might make more sense to replace that shrub entirely. For elm zigzag sawfly on large trees, that's going to be a very different scenario. An arborist might have to get involved. And then for things like spotted lanternfly, there's various approaches out there too. But again, we probably just don't quite have the time tonight to get into the details of all that.
PJ, I had contacted you last summer about a mystery caterpillar that I couldn't figure out. I didn't know I found it on my garage floor.
Yeah.
My first thought was, oh, it must be a red admiral because I have a lot of those flying around. And I looked at all my books. The pictures just did not match up. And you gave me some guesses as to what it might be. And it turned out it was a red admiral. And I was so shocked at how different, like the books gave different illustrations and the critter looked different. Like, I don't have a prayer of trying to figure out all these caterpillars.
So I will admit it can be a challenge. There are some good caterpillar guidebooks out there. Princeton Press has a really good one, which is often my go-to resource. I think they actually have maybe both of my go-to resources are from them. With some species of caterpillars, there can be a lot of different color forms, and that can really complicate things because often the field guides will have perhaps the commonest color form photographed, and they just don't have all the photos of the different color forms. Maybe those sorts of photos don't exist, or if your field guide is that size, you can only put in maybe 1 or 2 decent photos. There are some other ones out there that come to mind that are in that same ballpark. There's a caterpillar that can be kind of a pest in like sweet corn called corn earworm. It has a whole range of different color forms, from green to pink to yellow to brown. There's another big one called white line sphinx moth, and the adult is often mistaken for hummingbird. And that one's very similar. You can have green and brown and black and almost reddish color forms. And so it's all across the board. That can make it very challenging to identify these insects sometimes.
In the back. Okay, can you want to stand up so we can hear you? Okay. And maybe come up a little closer because you have can you come a little closer?
Some bugs have plague disease. Can they throw the trees?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
She said if the insects themselves have diseases, can they still do the damage to the trees?
Oh, that's a great question. So when it comes to insect diseases, there are some diseases that insects get sick with. And by the way, these are diseases that are really specific to insects. So you and I are not going to get sick with these diseases. It's only for insects that will get these diseases. When insects become infected with these diseases, they might still be able to feed and cause plant damage. It kind of depends on how quickly they get sick. So for that invasive spongy moth that I mentioned with the fungal disease Entomophaga maimaga, they can come down sick with that, and basically within a span of about 7 or so days, those caterpillars will die from it. They might be able to feed for another day or two, but then relatively quickly, it's going to halt their feeding damage. But there's a lot of different insects and insect diseases, and some of them may continue to feed for quite a while. In other cases, it may be very, very quick in terms of when they stop feeding. And I maybe have time for one more question. I've got 2 little ones at home. I've got to help get them down for bedtime. But if there's another quick question, I'd be more than happy to take that from the audience.
Are you keeping maps of the migration of insects north as the weather changes?
Yes, I think you were kind of asking about, do I have maps of like migratory insects? Is that correct?
Well, no, as the weather gets warmer, there's insects coming up from the south that we've never had before.
Yep. Okay.
Or at least in general, we don't have. And
Yeah.
we keep track of.
Yes and no. That probably doesn't help you much. So in general, I'm aware of some insects that over time are like pushing their way farther north. For some of those, we don't necessarily have maps for them per se. There are maybe some rough maps out there from websites such as iNaturalist, which is a citizen science website for folks can report these. But for insects like that, and one thing that comes to mind, a really good example for southeastern Wisconsin, there's an insect called a carpenter bee, which if I want to find carpenter bees, I would go to Lexington, Kentucky in about 2 weeks from now, late April. It's a great time of the year to find them down there. We do see carpenter bees, but they make it just into like the southeast corner of the state. Over time, as our growing conditions change, we get milder winters due to climate change, they're probably going to expand their range in the state. I would expect them to start popping up the eastern counties that border Lake Michigan, probably up to Door County, just because of the moderated climate. So we know there's some insects like that that are expanding their range over time. But if you think of all the costs involved, it's just hard to do surveys and really develop really, precise, accurate maps, it's hard to do. So again, we kind of have a general idea for how some of these insects are expanding. With my database at the Insect Diagnostic Lab, I have some records of this, generally speaking. But again, we've got about 20,000 different insect species in the state and more that are kind of inching their way. And so there's a lot of things to keep track of. And so we can have a general idea, but it's often hard to map them really specifically.
So PJ, at least we really appreciate you giving us information about all these insects and trends. And we'll be watching that. Thanks for creating the cicada website.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me this evening. And you'll probably be hearing more from me in the near future about these cicadas. They're going to be out in a little over a month, and the month of June will be our busiest month for them. So stay tuned, and if you have an opportunity, go see them. It's going to be pretty cool. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, it's easy when the speaker's not here.
If anybody is interested in looking at the